Welcome to They Learn, You Win, the podcast from Skooks. I'm your host, David Wentworth. I've known my next guest, Danny Johnson, for some time. We met back when I was an industry analyst and have been colleagues ever since. When I first met Danny, she was the vice president of learning research at Deloitte by Burson. She then co-founded Red Thread Research, where she's currently the principal analyst. This is Danny's second appearance on the show, and this time we dig into the report she and Red Thread just published, Developing Frontline Workers, Focus Where It Counts. The insights are not only spot on for companies with large frontline populations, but any organization overall. So let's get into it with Danny Johnson. Danny, thanks so much for joining me. We've known each other for a while, ran in a lot of the same circles as analysts, and I think I dare say friends now, maybe?
I think we are, yeah.
Oh, well, that's nice. I'm glad you agreed because I put you on the spot and you couldn't say otherwise.
Couldn't say no.
We're very excited, especially here at Skooks, about this report that you've published and on the frontline workers. In fact, it's called Developing Frontline Workers, putting the focus where it counts. And so we're going to dig into that. I want to, explore some of the findings and some of the things that we're seeing in the world around frontline. But first off, if you would, and maybe just let us know a little bit about, how you and Red Thread developed this report, where it comes from.
We started with where we usually start, which is a question: why are things the way that they are? Or why is everyone talking about things this way? Is where we started. There's been a lot of work, this, on Frontline in the last 5 years or so. Lots of people talking about it and putting stuff out there. And it's been really good stuff. But I think in the last 6 months or so, the climate has changed and everybody's sort of scared of their budgets and trying to figure out how to optimize and make things efficient and all that kind of stuff. And so the question came down to, all right, well, we've had some freedom and some money to do some things to develop people's careers up until now. I think that money is going to go away. And so how do we take the budget that we have and optimize it? And that led into a much richer conversation with the leaders that we talked to about what kinds of things they're developing and how they're doing it. That I think led to a pretty good framework for thinking about development of frontline workers. And it's actually been helpful to some of our members that aren't focused on frontline. It's a pretty good model just to think about what you're developing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it targets some specific challenges within a frontline workforce, but that the general principles are pretty universal.
Yeah.
If you think through it. And I wonder sometimes doing the work that we do, to me, I feel like, there's this sort of, I don't know if it's a resurgence or a surgence of focus on frontline workers recently. Yeah. And then I'm like, well, is that just because I've been focused on it more with some of the work that I've been doing? Or is it both things? I don't know. Do you have, are you able to extricate yourself a little bit from the work you've been doing?
I mean, I love that you brought that up because once you get into a research project, everything is that topic, right? So it's really hard to be like, this just applies. But I do think that there has been a little bit of a resurgence. I think it happened broadly during the pandemic. And it's been floating since then. And with all this work of, the conversations that we're having around AI, a lot of the jobs that are going to be efficientized, is that a word, are not the frontline jobs. They're jobs that are sort of desk jobs or knowledge worker jobs. And so this idea of frontline has become kind of stayed important because we know that those jobs, at least right now, aren't necessarily being minimized.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the time, right, they were called essential.
Yep.
That was a pretty,
they still are. We just don't call them
right.
that anymore.
It was a pretty elevated status to give these jobs that hadn't been thought of that way. And I worried that in the wake of the pandemic, everyone's like, okay, well, that's over. We just go back to churning people through these roles now. And I do notice, though, I think that the companies have recognized, you know what? If we focus, as just the report says, in these areas and we do stuff, we're starting to see results that we maybe weren't getting before. Yeah, I think back to memes of I think there was a picture of some kid in an ice cream store mascot costume going, how the hell am I essential? He's going into work during the pandemic goes, you mean me? But it's it turns out, well, yes, if you're out there and you're face to face with customers and you're focused on the brand, you're building the products, those kind of things, it turns out those are pretty essential. So yeah, I love this stuff. The report's fascinating to me. I love the idea that we can stop looking at, these jobs that I think are typically one of the things they are is high turnover industries, restaurants, retail, hospitality, things like that. And instead of looking at it it's high turnover, it's a given, so let's work around that. Starting to focus on how do we maybe slow that turnover a little bit?
Yeah.
Maybe let's not have this be a transitional job for everyone.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is, but it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting. Those are really competitive jobs, so it's high turnover for sure, but it's also really competitive. We talked to a mining company, and they're consistently in competition with their competition for good talent. Because if you can get a little bit more across the street and you don't feel any affinity for your organization, or they're not taking care of you or helping you grow, it's easy to walk across the street.
Absolutely. So, all right, with the sort of the lay of the land there, talking about these workers, and again, as you pointed out, you know, the workforce in general. But what are the basic findings from the report? What are the things that you saw that sort of stood out and went, oh, I see, where this is going?
I think the first thing that we saw is that most organizations are out of whack when it comes to how they're balancing their frontline. We saw basically three domains for frontline work. There's the license to operate stuff, the stuff that keeps you and your organization safe. So safety training, sexual harassment training, all of those types of things that make sure that everybody stays safe. And a really large chunk of money is going toward that kind of training because it is essential. Like, you have to have it to operate. But in the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years, with some of the new developments in the way that we develop people, especially online or with computers, we've tried to make those fancy. We've tried to make them fun. I don't care how many bells and whistles a compliance training course has. I don't know that they've ever been fun. So that's where the imbalance has mostly come, is through this idea of like license to operate stuff. The second area that we ran across is current performance. So once you get the license to operate stuff, your job is to actually help the organization perform better than it is, by giving people on the ground the skills that they need to get the organization where it needs to go. And so how do you do that better and more efficiently? And then the third one is this future readiness bit, which we've heard a lot about in the last 5 years, but we're hearing a lot less about in the last 6 to 9 months. And I'd love your take on that as well. As organizations are sort of swinging back to growth phase and not so much about the people, we're seeing less time and effort being spent on talent mobility and making sure people can grow and learn and developing people to move forward in the organization and those types of things.
Well, yeah, I think, well, the challenge there is, not to keep bringing up the pandemic for some reason, but you go back to before that, and people, organizations that thought they were change ready, right? They're like, wait, no, we're future ready, we're change ready. We
Yeah.
understand. No idea what was going to happen. They had no idea what was coming.
Right.
And now, are you future
Yeah.
ready? Like, are you ready for literally anything that can happen? And I think we're seeing right now, were you ready
Nobody
for
is.
this environment that we're in? I don't know if you were. So, it's hard, I think, for companies to get down to that level of, look, I don't know what my business is going to do, let alone what I need the individuals to do. So, I understand sort of how that disconnect happens. Unfortunately, if you keep the focus on the workforce, that's what's going to help you be, change ready. But it's hard to do that in practice. I mean, look, we all know how many priorities people are juggling anyway. We've seen it in research that we did, this idea around, hey, it turns out when you provide this particular workforce, typically hourly, deskless workers, when these people come into this job and you give them this clear line of sight that says you will be supported, you will have everything you need to know to do your job, and you have all these opportunities to pursue if you so desire, right? Like laying it out from the get-go, there are career paths. There is this mobility possibility. Those companies are finding way more success. Their retention numbers are better, even though retention turnover is still high-ish. It's lower than their competitors, and the people that are staying longer and they're doing better while they're there. And they're actually, when they leave, they're brand ambassadors. They're like, hey, I really got what I needed out of that last job at XYZ place. Let me tell you about it. So I think it's always important to stay on task with this focus stuff and not just go back to that first bucket when things get a little shaky.
I agree. I also think it's really hard because the license to operate stuff has to be done. And then current performance. So that future readiness bucket that you just talked about often gets short shrifted. It did even during the pandemic. We talked about it a lot. There's a lot of sort of noise about it. And organizations started going down that, but that's one of the first things that gets cut every single time.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like no amount of bells and whistles is going to make compliance training fun, and it's
Yeah.
okay, then don't, right? Like that's, and to me that's I think we've had the personal conversation about
Yeah.
this. It's like, okay, if you need this stuff done, then let's do it. Let's be efficient about it and get it out of the way. Because to me, I've always been saying this, not just about compliance training, other training as well, but the engagement piece. It isn't the bells and the whistles that's in the training. That doesn't matter. It's, why is this important? What's it going to do for me? the what's in it for me. If you can lay that out, say, listen, you got to do this. Not you're in trouble if you don't.
Right.
It's because you do this. Um, People are not going to be running each other over in the warehouse with forklifts, and it's going to make it a much better place to work.
Yeah.
Like it sounds simplistic, but if you can draw that line, and it's like, oh, okay, I will dedicate the X minutes it takes to do this, get in and get out. Now then we can move on to these sort of other buckets. What can I do
Yeah.
to grow or to learn new skills or what have you?
And I think what's really interesting is I mean, there are check boxes that we've got to check when it comes to compliance training, but I've seen organizations do this really well. Like they're using stand-up meetings to do it. There was one organization that we did a little bit of work with who used a 5-minute sort of safety moment at the beginning of every single meeting that they had, that somebody shared a safety moment to create that culture of safety, to reinforce some of those things. And so a lot of times I think we make it a lot harder than it needs to be. Give them the training, reinforce it in sort of systems and processes that you already have, tighten up, what it means to do this well and move on.
Right. I mean, something else I say a lot is I think sometimes L&D leaders, L&D professionals overestimate people's desire to do this stuff, right? To take part in learning. So, let's
Yep.
meet them where they are, right? Let's
Yeah, for sure.
understand, read the room, and let's give them what they need. And like then all this other cool sort of, I don't really want to even say experimental, but these other things, let's apply that in other places, right? Where you can have a much bigger impact on the kind of things that you're trying to do. And I think, again, I think that's what your findings have sort of said is, yeah, there's time and space for everything. And just because the license to operate stuff is mission critical doesn't mean you do that at the expense of everything else.
Right. That's actually one of the biggest things that came out of this is like the goal when you're thinking about the license to operate stuff is to be an essentialist. Like get in there, get it done, get out. And that includes things like, tightening up what proficiency even means. Do we need all of this stuff or do they just need to know these things? In some organizations, we even saw just reducing the inconsistency of the training content across the thing, like just yielded tons of efficiency. And then, even the training logistics, like how do you look at the day of those folks and not take them out of the work, but still make sure that they get the types of things. Like seriously, like be as essential as you can, make it as small as you can, but no smaller.
And that's where this other thing that we talk about in other areas around, that being a strategic business partner, having partnerships with the business, having people that understand what those constraints are, right? As an L&D professional, yeah, you probably know, your business and your organization you work for. I'm not going to short sell anybody on their own knowledge of how their company operates, but you still will never have as close a finger on the pulse to the workforce as the people who run those segments of the business, the managers who know what people are doing and expected to do day in and day out, and know where you can sort of airdrop the learning where it makes the most sense. So making sure you've got that person so you can actually do the targeted things that you're talking about. I also wanted to ask you if you have any insights on, when you're doing this stuff, when you talk about essentialist, right? I think one of the things about, and again, this gets into it's a lot of onboarding, a lot of compliance stuff, right? I think companies get a little worried about um, deviating from the plan when it comes to compliance because it is so sometimes critical and check the box. It's like, well, we can't do it any differently because it has to follow this pattern. Whereas the idea of, okay, can we at least account for prior knowledge? Can we figure out where people are? So we're not forcing someone to sit through this thing, to click through this thing that they've already done 4 times because they've been in the industry. Is there the possibility to do that? Because I know sometimes the compliance stuff comes from like agencies or third party where it's like, it
Right.
has to be this.
Yep.
But do you see our companies willing to sort of change and do this, like really get essential and say, you're only going to get what you need?
Oh yeah. And I do think it depends on like the governing body. You know what I mean? So like the FAA requires a certain number of hours of training, and so that's what they do is a certain number of hours of training. And so trying to figure out how you do that in a more efficient way is really hard because they still have to spend an hour doing it. But for a lot of organizations, yeah, we're seeing them sort of think differently. Finally, we're starting to see people think differently and outside the idea of a course because of some of the developments that we've seen in technology over the last couple of years. Adaptive learning is getting in there. We're seeing that, and we're even seeing some interesting stuff with bots. Like have a conversation with a bot and figure out where that person is with respect to their knowledge of the thing, and then give them feedback on that thing. And so I do think organizations are really open to it, and I especially think they're open to it if it means that there's less time off the floor, which is really essential for frontline workers.
Yeah, I mean that's the
Yeah,
whole thing, right? It's they're deskless and they're hourly, so you can't say, "Hey, take a look at this when you're at home,"
exactly.
or on the train. So you've got to somehow fit it into the workday in a way that makes the most sense. Yeah, I think that's cool. All right, so we cover the essentials. I think that's one of the things, aside from maybe the way you approach it, companies they get it that like, look, this is the stuff we got to get done. We got to do it. The next sort of thing where you found a lot of things falling into is the detective part, right? So there's the essentials, and there's like figuring stuff out. And I think this is really where what you do as an L&D professional, this is where that shifts, right? So
Yeah.
what your definition, what do you mean when you tell somebody, you need to be more of a detective?
This is sort of like the goal of that second bucket, which is current performance, improving current performance. Your whole goal is to be a detective. And we're seeing L&D dig into things like skills. We're having more conversation. We're hearing more conversations about skills than we ever have, and data in ways that we never have before, because they're realizing the importance of being a detective. So the days of even personas, like developing for a persona or developing a peanut butter approach that meets everybody's needs, is going away, and L&D organizations are going in with like a scalpel and saying, all right, here are the critical skill gaps that we have in our organization that are keeping us from doing that thing, that are really helping to solve some of these higher cost problems that organizations have. And so it becomes much more of a like, we're not trying to meet everybody's needs and the squeakiest wheel doesn't get the oil. This actually is more about what is the organization actually trying to do and how do we get them there as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, that's another right trend that we're seeing where, if you go to anything that's L&D focused, skills is the thing, right? That's what
Yeah.
everyone's, and it's like, okay, it's not that we didn't care about skills before. Maybe we weren't talking about it in that way prior. But is this the result of a shift where learning is starting to say, let's take some ownership of skills, as opposed to when the organization did try to do something with skills, they would just say, here's our skills autonomy, help us.
The short answer is yes. I think L&D is starting to realize that they really are on a burning platform. Like we've had it pretty easy for quite a while as far as like having to show I don't want to say show value because that's not the right thing, but connect what you do to what the organization is achieving, and data and understanding the skills of the individuals is how you get there. And so um, in our study of skills, and we have a large body of research on skills, L&D was one of the first sort of groups to jump in because they're like, oh, if we can understand the skills that people have and the skills that the organization needs, then we can pinpoint things much more easily and personalize and make it more efficient and blah, blah, blah. So they were the first ones in that discussion. And now it has broadened big enough that we're getting all kinds of data from other parts of the organization that can help us understand those skills and help tailor stuff so that we can fill those critical skill gaps that are going to have the biggest effect on the organization. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, in sort of about time, that we start to do more of that
Yes.
from the L&D side. It had always been a challenge of, even if an organization could articulate what skills that they needed, which, let's say that that's still a challenge. Even if they could do that, the solution was always, okay, well then hire these people, right? We need these skills, get them in the house, let's do it. As opposed to, oh, we're almost there in a lot of places. If we just help people get over the hump, or this person didn't even realize that they had an affinity for this, and maybe we can move them. And that internal mobility thing comes across. And again, we always have to come back to this. Internal mobility is not always right, not always up. It's just, maybe it's different. And especially in these frontline places where maybe somebody, again, has this job, doesn't necessarily want to be a manager of any kind, enjoys jobs, good at it, but maybe there's other things that they're skilled at, and they can help the organization in that way.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think as technology plays a bigger role in the lives of everyone, and I'm talking specifically about AI here because we're seeing organizations sort of uproot their systems and processes and rethink them. As that happens, then being cross skilled, even if you're not trying to move up in an organization, is going to become very important. So, being really transparent about the skills that you have and gaining skills that the organization needs is going to be key to making sure that everybody gets what they need out of that relationship between the employer and the employee.
Yeah, yeah. No, and we made it 20 minutes before we said AI. So that might be a new record, but it matters, especially in
Yeah.
the skills conversation, because it's every piece of the spectrum of the skills conversation, AI appears, whether it's mapping skills, to learning, to jobs. AI is going to play a huge role in that. Whether it's the skills themselves, do you have the skills to leverage AI in the job that you do? Do you have the skills, or can you develop a different set of skills now that AI is maybe doing some of the things that you are doing? Like it's everywhere. It's part of the conversation, and it's real, and it's not just the AI headlines of crazy art, or stealing IP, or all of these things. It's literally about the technologies that we're using are getting better and faster and smarter in a lot of ways. It's not perfect, but this is one of those moments where it isn't just like, well, if I wait long enough, this fad train will run by and everyone will have forgotten about it. This is just the way that technology is going to work. And we all have to figure out how we best can leverage that in our own roles.
I think we're also seeing, I don't know if you're seeing this, Dave, too, but we're also seeing people talk about big AI, not little AI. So for the last 3 years, we've been sort of trying to figure out little AI, like a little thing that sits on your shoulder and helps you do your job better. But we're seeing organizations leverage all of the data, across all of the functions, and say, all right, well, if we have all this information, then we can actually fix some of these processes that have been band-aided for years. And that may mean reorganizing work. And if we reorganize work, that means reskilling the people and cross-skilling the people, because we have to reorganize that work. And so it really is crucial that, when we're talking about being a detective, this is what we're talking about. Not just understanding the skills gaps that exist today in the processes that exist today, but understanding what could be based on the technology that is out there, and trying to stay just a little bit ahead of the game.
Yeah, I'd heard you mention that before, and it's such an important observation that I touched on it in a actually in a session that I did, and I didn't realize how it was connected to that until just now. That one of the things I talked to L&D professionals about AI within L&D technology is, if you ever remember back when social networks were like the big thing, and every platform that was in the organization, whether it was finance, sales, learning, HR, had some form of social wall or some sort of, and it's, oh, so you think your employees show up every day and they want to log into 6 different social feeds
Right.
and talk to people about that particular they don't, and they didn't, and it went away. I feel like we're now in this era of like sort of the chatbot. This is the thing, like, well, our thing comes with and they give it some clever name, and it's like, here's our chatbot. And it's like, okay, I can see the usefulness and the functionality, but do we need 7 of these?
Right.
And do we need even 5 of them that are only looking at this small slice of things? And you mentioned like big AI, like, okay, if presumably the gift of AI is that it's so super smart and has access to every piece of information and knowledge that's ever been created, and that's what makes it so powerful within the organization, how powerful is it going to be if you're only looking at this function, this data, right? So in order for it to work, like say big AI over the top, the whole organization, it's taking in information and data from everywhere that it can to like help paint a picture of the organization.
Yeah.
I hope people can get ready for that. I mean, I don't, am I seeing that a little differently than you do, or?
I don't think you're seeing it differently. I had a conversation on the podcast that we did earlier this week that maybe changed my mind a little bit, because I've been thinking in terms of the single pane of glass as well, right? Like all this stuff is going to happen behind the scenes, and there's going to be like one thing that the individual sees, that's how they're going to interact with all this stuff in the organization. Um, he sees the back end a little bit more, and he's like, yeah, that's really big. Like that's a really big thing. And do I think it's still going to come? Yes. Do I think organizations are going to have bots for that organization? I absolutely do. But he was talking like, do you need that bot to tell you how to interact with Excel, or is it okay that Excel's open and it has its own bot sort of interacting with Excel, if that makes sense? So sort of the corralling of different things, kind of based on the specialty that particular thing does, as long as you don't get them confused, and as long as they're like right there when you need them. Is that a better way to do it? Or is that single pane of glass where everything is just integrated in going to happen? And I'm not really sure I know yet. I hadn't necessarily thought about the back end challenges of getting all of that integrated and still keeping your company safe. So that's where my mind started to explode a little bit. But I do see like some of this, some of the stuff that these HCMs are doing with bots, bot corrals and bot chaining and stuff like that leads me to believe that we're going to get closer to that single pane of glass, or that one bot that rules them all.
Yeah, but I get your point. I think in those moments where you need that very specific help in the
Right.
moment in app, then of
Mm-hmm.
course you don't need some ChatGPT or Gemini
Right.
telling you some fabricated story about, the
Right.
origins of the Excel spreadsheets. I just need to know how to, yeah,
Do
do
the
the
thing.
thing. I could see that maybe it's going to be the broad single pane of glass with targeted assistance, where,
Yeah.
when and where you need it. All right. So, all this future talk sort of gets us into the third segment of how to address things with Frontline, again, also in general, but that is this being a strategist, right? And figuring things out. So let's talk a little bit about that, because once you're able to sort of start to do that detective work, that's when you can start to become a strategist, right?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Just making a point here that came to me as we were doing this. For a lot of years, we've been talking about L&D having a seat at the table and being strategic and all those things. And I think those things are really super important. But if you look at license to operate and current performance and future readiness, they're all very dependent on alignment to a larger business and probably skills and probably talent strategy. And so that's one of the things that came out of this for me is like L&D needs to be plugged in as closely as it can be to the rest of the organization. This is a time to step out from behind the desk and leave the ivory tower and actually go amongst the people, because that's where we're going to find the answers to the things that we're trying to solve. So when we look at the future, when we talk about being a strategist, we're actually talking about building the skills for what's next. And that's aligning the development to your organization's direction. So if somebody's going heavy in AI, then obviously you need AI. But in what sense do you need AI? That's something that you can only figure out by having those conversations and sort of doubling down on that. And so the organizations that we've seen that seem to be doing a pretty good job of this are those that have identified the 7 or 8 skills that they need to deliver their strategy 2 or 3 years out. We're no longer talking 5 or 10 year strategies because that's too far out. But 2 years seems to be kind of where we're hearing it. What are the skills that our organization needs now so that we can get to that in 2 years? And how do we develop those skills on sort of a large scale? Is what we're seeing. So we're not trying to just help somebody do their job better in the system that they currently exist in, but what are those skills that are going to help us get to where we need to go? And a lot of organizations, interestingly, are focusing on the very human skills because AI changes everything overnight. Every month we hear something new. What AI is doing is so training everybody up in a specific version of whatever technology is out there may not be the best thing to do. But what we are hearing a lot is communication skills are key. The ability to be curious is key. The ability to adapt is key. And so how do we develop these bigger sort of strategic skills, and how do we understand which ones they are so that we can get where we're going?
I've seen this pop up time and time, and it gives me great hope that there will be continued to be this focus on the human side of things as AI increases its footprint. It's just going to be that much more critical, and then not to just sort of wait and see what's left and say, okay, that's the human part,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
to start now to grow and develop. And you're spot on with like the communication thing. I have kids, and I tell them since they were little, I say, if you can figure out how to take whatever thought you have in your head and articulate it to someone else in a coherent way, you're steps ahead. That's all. You got to
Yes.
be able to do that. Before we get too far away from the strategy part, because I'm talking about, what the business is going to need, this sort of 3 to 5 year strategy. Do you have any thoughts, insights, help for organizations to say, how do I know that I'm making progress? How do I know that I'm doing it the right way? Right? Because we always talk about measurement, impact. The next follow up is always, well, what do I measure? And it's in a thing like this, how do I know that I'm on the right path?
So we, and by we I mean me, have been saying for like 10 years, measure what the organization measures, right? Like L&D metrics aren't bad. They can help you become more efficient, I suppose. But unless what you do is tied to what the organization is trying to do, it doesn't really help you adapt or adjust based on what's going on. So if we're measuring turnover, if turnover is a really big deal to our organization, then we as L&D should measure correlations with what we're doing and turnover, and see how we can affect those things short term and long term. Same thing goes with sales. So if sales is really important, then our job is to ensure a skilled workforce when it comes to sales and measure the sales based on the kinds of things that we're teaching and training our sales folks to do.
It seems strange sometimes to say that, but whenever we talk about these things with L&D professionals and say just what you're saying, it's like, remember, we're not asking you to create metrics out of thin air. You don't, just
Right.
because you want to move away from just doing completions and just doing smile sheets and assessment, quiz answers. Um, Once you get past that, doesn't mean you have to suddenly invent metrics.
Right.
Your business is already capturing the things that are important to it.
Right.
It's there.
Yep.
You just have to find out who owns it, what it means, like what is good, right? And figure out how to correlate it. Being that partner, that's how you do that. You have those conversations with the people who work with that data every day, and you say, well, if this happens, that's how I know things are getting better. Oh, okay, and then let's work on that. I hate when things that I say, and maybe you've run into this. You've been an analyst for a long time too, when they sound so obvious sometimes when you say them, but
Yeah.
in the day-to-day trenches of doing the job, sometimes it's really hard to do.
For sure. I think it is hard to do. I also think if you have an inferiority complex, which a lot of L&D folks do, it's hard to sort of like say, this is important. I'm going to go talk to the person who has this data and build that relationship and make sure I can get that data. Derek Mitchell, if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, you should. He's at Novo Nordisk. He's a stats guy. He's a numbers guy, an analytics guy. I mean, I interviewed him once for some of the research we were doing on measurement. And I said, okay, Derek, people are telling me, this is really hard. And so where do you start? And he's like, it's not hard. He's like, you figure out the thing that you want to move. You go find the person who has the data that can help you understand if you can move that or not. You make friends with them. You get that data feed in. You figure out if you've moved it because they've got historical data most likely on the thing. And then you go find another thing and work on another thing. And pretty soon all this data is coming in and your organization is thinking about data and making decisions on data. It's not hard. It's just, take it a step at a time. And I thought that was really good advice. The other piece of really good advice I've heard when it comes to measurement is, and analytics is, data isn't immediately useful. If you're an engineer or a mathematician, it needs to be a vector in order to be useful. There needs to be a direction associated with the data in order to be useful to help you understand what you should do. And so sometimes it takes a bit. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 months to get some data to understand if you're moving it. The good thing though is a lot of times those KPIs that you are trying to move have data somewhere in the organization with historical data. And so if you can go find them, if you can go find those places and bring that data in, sometimes you can be like, okay, we had an intervention 2 weeks ago. Before that, what was it? And what is it now, to kind of see that? And so I think a lot of it, honestly, is just mindset. How do we start caring about the same metrics that the rest of the organization is caring about? And then how do we go after it?
Yeah. And just breaking that inertia of
Right.
having not done it
Right.
previously. Like, it's a new thing maybe and like, so how do we fit that in with all the other stuff we're doing? But, essentially the idea is if you start doing it, it makes a lot of the other things you're doing easier because you're sort of putting all your efforts in the right place, in the right direction.
It also gives you a lot of credibility.
The single data point, I think that's a trap that people fall in, but that's like saying, you visit Arizona one day and it was 85 degrees. Okay. You're not really aware of what the weather's really like there, and this is where AI comes back into the conversation, right? Of being able to recognize patterns. And so, people have gone back and look at like, oh, I looked at the last 3 months of data and it always does this. It turns out over the last, 24 months, it only did that once. And it was an anomaly, and you can't build to that. You can't work with that. So having, tools that can look at vast, longer bits of data faster than you can, I think is going to be really important. So, what's on the horizon for you? I know I just saw you in London. I'm sure I'm going to see you in DC.
So we'll be in DC, and then we're getting brave this year and doing our own conference. So Red Thread is doing a conference in June in Salt Lake City, and it's super scary, but we're pretty excited about kind of how it's going, what it's doing.
Well, good luck with that.
Thank you very much. Then as far as research goes, like we've been asked to study the future of the L&D department, like the structure of what L&D should look like in organizations given all these changes and what's happening. I expect that to be valid for like 3 or 4 months, and then a new piece of technology will come out and it'll tip it on its butt. And then we're also doing some larger scale research on AI and L&D.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually happy to hear that. Is despite the constant conversation around AI, I think being able to actually dig in and do some research and show the reality of what's happening is the key to all of it. So I'm glad to hear that you're doing that, and maybe bring some sanity to these conversations. So. Well, Danny, I really appreciate you, sharing with us and getting into this report, which, my organization is sharing quite a bit. And so it's great to get some under the hood looks at it. But yeah, I think this is a really critical time for frontline workers. I think there's just going to be so much reliance on them to get it done. As you say, if with the economic turmoil and so forth, whatever happens within an organization, if they want to stay in business, they're going to have the people on the front line doing the things, whether it's building the product, talking to the customers, delivering the brand experience, whatever it is, that's always going to be the thing. So we got to get better at helping those people. So thank you. This report, I think, will help organizations sort of, think about this in a new way, I hope.
I hope so too.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, and looking forward to seeing you again in person soon. And we'll talk to you again.
Likewise, David. It's always a good time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of They Learn, You Win, presented by Skooks. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe in your podcast player. And follow me, David Wentworth, on LinkedIn. I try to distill what works and what doesn't for L&D leaders so you can stay up to speed on the latest insights, ideas, and tech. See you next time.